The woman no one would touch. The infant's wail cut through the market square like a death knell. Caleb Moore stood in the center of the crowd, dirt-streaked and wild-eyed, his son dying in his arms. 3 wet nurses had already turned him away. The town doctor shook his head. Nothing more could be done. As desperate silence fell, Caleb's gaze landed on the one woman everyone pretended not to see. Lena Harper, the fat widow who sold day-old bread from a crooked cart, whose own baby had died just weeks before. Their eyes met across 20 feet of judgment and shame, and in that moment, 2 outcasts recognized the only hope either of them had left. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. Now, let me tell you about the day 2 broken people saved each other's lives. The bread wasn't selling. Lena Harper stood behind her cart in the corner of Belmont's Market Square, watching the Saturday crowd flow past her like water around a stone. Families, couples, ranchers with calloused hands and money in their pockets. They bought from everyone else, the butcher, the fabric merchant, even young Timothy Watts with his dubious miracle tonic, but they didn't buy from her. They never did. She adjusted the cloth covering her unsold loaves, her thick fingers smoothing wrinkles that didn't matter. The bread was good. She knew it was good. Her late husband Michael had always said she had magic in her hands when it came to baking, but Michael was 2 years dead, killed when his horse threw him into a ravine, and magic didn't pay rent. At 24, Lena had learned that the world judged women by their waistlines as much as their reputations, and hers had failed on both counts. Shameful, she heard Mrs. Cunningham whisper to her daughter as they passed. A woman that size taking up space in the square. And after what happened with her baby, Lena's jaw tightened. She didn't turn, didn't react. She'd learned that too. 6 weeks ago, she'd given birth to a daughter, alone, because the midwife had been delayed in a storm. The baby had lived for 3 hours, long enough for Lena to name her Rose, long enough to memorize the shape of her tiny fingers, and then she'd simply stopped breathing. The town had called it God's mercy. Lena called it the moment her heart stopped beating properly. She'd buried Rose in the cemetery on the hill, in a plot she couldn't afford, next to Michael's grave. The headstone was small. The town's charity was smaller. When she'd returned to her rented attic room above the general store, her milk had come in with a vengeance, and she'd spent 3 agonizing weeks binding her breasts, fever-sick and alone, while the town whispered about divine judgment and the wages of gluttony. Now she sold bread no one wanted and tried not to disappear entirely. The market was loud with Saturday commerce. Ranchers negotiated cattle prices. Children chased each other between stalls. The smell of roasting meat mixed with dust and horse manure and the sweet rot of overripe fruit. Lena breathed it all in, this evidence of life continuing without her, and wondered how much longer she could hold on. Her rent was 3 weeks overdue. Mr. Garrett, who owned the general store, had stopped being patient. She had $4.60 to her name, and her cart, bought with the last of Michael's insurance money, was falling apart. Lena. She looked up. Samuel Pritchard, the banker's son, stood before her cart. 20 years old, handsome in that clean-cut way that came with money and good breeding. He'd never spoken to her before. Mr. Pritchard. She kept her voice neutral. His smile was thin, uncomfortable. I was wondering if you'd considered my father's offer. She had. The bank owned her debt now, had bought it from Mr. Garrett last month. And 2 weeks ago, Silas Pritchard had made his position clear. She could work off what she owed by cleaning the bank after hours, alone, with his son supervising. The way Samuel looked at her now, like she was something curious and slightly disgusting but potentially available, made her skin crawl. I'm managing, she said quietly. Are you? Samuel's gaze traveled deliberately down her body and back up. Because it doesn't look that way from where I'm standing. A woman in your position can't afford to be proud, Lena. My father's being generous. Tell your father I appreciate his generosity, but I'll find another way. Samuel's smile vanished. There is no other way. You're 3 weeks behind on a room you can barely afford, selling bread nobody wants. You think anyone in this town will hire you? You think anyone will even look at you? He leaned closer, voice dropping. You're lucky my father sees value where others see waste. Lena's hands clenched beneath the cart's edge. Her nails bit into her palms. She wanted to scream at him, to shove him away, to tell him exactly what she thought of his father's value. But she'd learned that anger was a luxury fat women couldn't afford. I said no. Her voice was steady, cold. Now please step away from my cart. Samuel's face darkened. For a moment she thought he might argue. Then he straightened, brushing imaginary dust from his jacket. You'll regret this. My father doesn't make offers twice. He walked away, and Lena released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The sun climbed higher, the crowd thinned. By noon she'd sold exactly 3 loaves, earning her 30 cents that would disappear into the vast ocean of what she owed. She was packing up her remaining bread. She'd eat it herself this week, making it last, when the sound cut through the square. A baby crying. Not the fussy whimper of a tired child, but the raw, desperate wail of an infant in true distress. Lena's head snapped up. Her body responded before her mind could catch up. Milk that shouldn't still be there tingling painfully in breasts that remembered a daughter who'd never grown strong enough to cry like that. The crowd was parting, murmuring, moving aside to create a circle around something, someone in the center of the square. Lena abandoned her cart and pushed forward. Her size, usually a source of shame, became useful now. People moved aside, too surprised or too disgusted to hold their ground, and she broke through to the front of the gathering crowd. A man stood in the center of the square. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate little, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face carved sharp by exhaustion and grief. His shirt was stained with something dark. Blood, Lena realized, and his hands shook as he held a tiny bundle wrapped in what had once been a clean blanket. The baby in his arms was dying. Lena knew it instantly, with the terrible clarity of experience. The child's cry was weakening, becoming thin and reedy. Its tiny face was red, then pale, then red again. The man, young, maybe 30, with eyes the color of winter storms, was looking around wildly, desperately, at a crowd that watched with morbid fascination but offered nothing. Please, his voice cracked. Someone. Anyone. My son needs to eat. He hasn't eaten in 2 days. My wife, his voice broke entirely. My wife is dead. She died 3 days ago. The baby won't take the bottle. Dr. Marsh says there's nothing more he can do. I need a wet nurse. I need someone who can... You already asked every wet nurse in town, Moore, someone called from the crowd. They all said no. Because you didn't pay Mary Simmons what you owed her last year, added Mrs. Cunningham, her voice sharp with righteousness. She told everyone you're not to be trusted. The man, Moore, turned toward the voice, his face desperate. That was a misunderstanding. I paid her. I swear I paid her. Please, this is my son. He's dying. Should have thought of that before you got behind on your debts, another voice said. Should have thought of that before your wife died birthing him, someone else muttered, and nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Lena felt something crack open inside her chest. The baby's cry was weakening further, becoming a whimper. Moore's hands were shaking so badly now that the bundle in his arms trembled. His eyes, those gray, storm-colored eyes, swept the crowd one more time, looking for mercy in a town that had none to spare. And then his gaze landed on Lena. She saw the moment he recognized what she was. Not just another face in the crowd, but someone specific. Someone who might understand. His eyes widened slightly, taking in her size, her stained dress, the flowers still dusted across her thick forearms. She saw him calculating, remembering, putting pieces together. Everyone in town knew about the fat widow whose baby had died. Everyone knew she'd tried to nurse the child, that her body had been ready even if her daughter hadn't been strong enough to live. Everyone knew, and no one had cared. Until now. Moore took a step toward her. The crowd shifted, murmuring. Someone laughed, a cruel, knowing sound. You're not seriously considering asking her, Mrs. Cunningham said, her voice dripping with disgust. Moore ignored her. He crossed the space between them in 4 long strides, and suddenly he was standing directly in front of Lena, this tall, desperate stranger with a dying baby in his arms and nothing left to lose. Ma'am. His voice was hoarse, broken.
I know we haven't met. I know you don't owe me anything, but my son is dying. He won't take the bottle. He needs—" His voice cracked again. "I heard about your loss. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But if there's any chance you could help him, just once, just to get him through today, I'll pay you anything, everything I have. Please." Lena stared at him, at the baby in his arms, at the crowd watching with a mixture of shock and gleeful anticipation, eager to see what the fat widow would do when confronted with her own tragedy reflected back at her. The baby whimpered, a thin, failing sound that stabbed through Lena's chest like a blade. She should say no. She should walk away. This man was a stranger. His debts and his tragedy weren't her responsibility. Getting involved would only bring more judgment, more whispers, more reasons for the town to despise her. But that baby was dying.
And 6 weeks ago, she'd held her own daughter as she stopped breathing, and she'd been powerless to save her. Lena looked up at Moore. His eyes were red-rimmed, desperate, honest in their grief. "Let me see him," she said quietly. Moore blinked. For a moment he seemed unable to process her words. Then, with hands that shook so badly, he nearly dropped the bundle. He extended his son toward her. Lena took the baby carefully, supporting the tiny head with practiced instinct. The blanket fell away slightly, revealing a face that was far too pale, lips that were cracked and dry, eyes closed in exhaustion. The child couldn't be more than a week old, maybe less. She pulled the blanket back further, checking. Boy. Underweight, skin loose over tiny ribs. But breathing, still breathing. "When did he last eat?" she asked, not looking up from the baby. 2 days ago, maybe 3. I've been trying the bottle every hour. He takes a little, then spits it up. Doctor said his stomach might be too weak. Said if he doesn't eat soon—" Moore's voice failed. Lena touched the baby's cheek gently. He didn't respond. Didn't even turn toward her finger the way a healthy infant should, searching for food. The crowd was silent now. Watching. Waiting. "Lena Harper, you can't be serious," Mrs. Cunningham said, her voice sharp with warning. "That child belongs to Caleb Moore. Everyone knows what kind of man he is. A drifter, a debtor. His wife wasn't even from here, showed up pregnant and died before anyone knew her name. You attach yourself to him, and you'll be ruined." "I'm already ruined, Mrs. Cunningham," Lena said softly, still looking at the baby. "You made sure of that." She raised her eyes to Moore, to Caleb. "I can try, but I can't promise anything. My daughter—" Her voice caught. She forced it steady. "My daughter only lived 3 hours. I don't know if what I have is still good. I don't know if it's enough." "It's more than he has now," Caleb said, and the raw gratitude in his voice nearly broke her. "Lena, think about what you're doing," Samuel Pritchard's voice cut through the crowd. He'd come back, drawn by the spectacle. "You help him. You're associating yourself with a man who can't pay his debts. My father won't look kindly on that." Lena looked at Samuel, at his clean clothes and soft hands, and the cruelty masquerading as concern in his eyes. Then she looked at Caleb Moore, standing in the center of the square covered in his dead wife's blood, holding his dying son, with nothing left but desperate hope. "Tell your father," Lena said clearly, "that I'm done being looked at kindly by men who see value where others see waste." Samuel's face flushed dark red. The crowd murmured. Lena turned to Caleb. "I live above the general store, the room at the top of the back stairs. We need to go now, before—" She glanced at the baby. "Before it's too late." Caleb nodded once, sharp and grateful. "I'll follow you." They walked together through the parting crowd, Lena cradling the baby against her chest, Caleb walking close beside her like a guard. The whispers started immediately, scandalized, delighted, cruel, but Lena didn't look back. She'd stopped looking back 6 weeks ago, when they'd lowered Rose into the ground, and she'd realized that grief was something you either learned to carry or let destroy you. She chose to carry it. Huck. The stairs to her attic room were narrow and steep. Caleb followed her up, ducking his head beneath the low ceiling at the top. The room was small, just a bed, a table, a chair, a washstand, and a tiny stove in the corner. Clean, but sparse. The kind of room that spoke of poverty maintained with dignity. Lena set the baby on her bed gently, then moved to lock the door. Not because she feared Caleb, but because she knew the town. Within minutes, someone would come knocking, full of concern and judgment in equal measure. "Sit," she told Caleb, gesturing to the chair. He sat, his long frame folding awkwardly in the small space. His eyes never left his son. Lena moved to the washstand and cleaned her hands thoroughly. Then she unwrapped the baby completely, checking him over with gentle efficiency. Caleb watched in silence as she examined his son, testing the looseness of his skin, the dryness of his mouth, the weakness of his reflexes. "What's his name?" she asked quietly. "Shima. I haven't—" Caleb's voice was rough. "I was waiting for my wife to wake up. She died before she could name him." Lena looked up at him. At this man who'd been living in hell for 3 days, trying to keep his son alive while mourning a wife who'd never woken. "Then we'll call him Baby Moore until you're ready to choose." Caleb nodded, his jaw tight. Lena rebound the baby loosely in his blanket, then sat on the edge of the bed. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, suddenly aware of what she was about to do. She'd nursed Rose in private, alone, with no one to judge the intimacy of it. This was different. A stranger's child. A man watching. But the baby was dying, and propriety was a luxury neither of them could afford. "Turn around," she said quietly. Caleb turned immediately, presenting his back. Lena appreciated the quickness of it, the lack of argument. She unbuttoned the front of her dress with fingers that trembled only slightly, working the fabric aside. Her breasts were still bound. She'd never stopped binding them after Rose died, as though suppressing her body's response would suppress the grief. But she unwound the cloth with practiced motions until she was free. The relief was immediate and painful. Her body had never fully understood that Rose was gone. She picked up the baby carefully, positioning him against her breast. He didn't respond at first, too weak even to turn his head. Lena stroked his cheek gently, encouraging him, using the techniques the midwife had taught her in those brief 3 hours she'd been a mother. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on, little one. Just try." Nothing. Behind her she heard Caleb shift in his chair, heard the creak of wood, the harsh sound of his breathing. "Please," he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. "Please, God, please." The baby's mouth opened. Lena caught her breath. She guided him carefully, her heart hammering. The baby's lips closed around her nipple, weak and uncertain. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he began to suck. It hurt. Her body wasn't ready, and the baby's latch was poor, uncoordinated with weakness. But Lena didn't care. She felt the pull, felt the milk begin to flow, and tears spilled down her face as the baby's sucking grew stronger, more desperate, more alive. "He's eating," she said, her voice breaking. "Caleb, he's eating!" She heard the chair scrape back, heard Caleb's sharp intake of breath. She didn't turn around, couldn't, not like this, but she felt his presence behind her close enough that she could hear the raggedness of his breathing. "Thank God," he whispered. "Thank God. Thank you." The baby nursed for nearly 10 minutes before he fell asleep, milk-drunk and exhausted. Lena held him for a moment longer, memorizing the weight of him, the warmth. Then carefully, she shifted him away and adjusted her clothing, buttoning her dress with shaking fingers. "You can turn around," she said quietly. Caleb turned. His face was wet with tears he hadn't bothered to hide. He looked at his son, sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, color already beginning to return to his tiny face, and something in him seemed to break and heal simultaneously. He stopped, swallowed hard. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already did," Lena said. She stood carefully, cradling the baby, and handed him back to his father. Caleb took him with reverent gentleness, tucking his son against his chest. "He'll need to eat again in a few hours," Lena said, her voice steadier now, professional. "Maybe sooner. His stomach's been empty too long. He won't be able to take much at a time at first. You should—" She paused. "You should probably go home. Get some rest. Bring him back when he wakes." Caleb looked up at her, and in his eyes was something she hadn't seen directed at her in 2 years. Respect, gratitude, recognition that she was a person who mattered. "I live 15 miles from town," he said quietly, "at the base of Wolf Ridge. My ranch, it's small, just me and my son now. If I take him home and he needs to eat again, I can't make that ride twice a day. Not with him this week." He paused. "Would you? Is there any way you could come with us? Just for a few days until he's stronger. I'll pay you. I'll give you everything I have. You can have your own room, your own space. I won't—" He stopped, seeming to realize how the request might sound. "I'm not asking for anything improper. Just help for my son." Lena stared at him. Leave town, go to a stranger's ranch, put herself completely at the mercy of a man she'd met an hour ago, with nothing but his word that she'd be safe. It was insane. It was also her only option. "The town won't like it," she said quietly. "The town already doesn't like you," Caleb said, "and it wasn't cruel, just honest. At least at my ranch, no one will be watching, no one will be whispering, and my son needs you." Lena looked at the sleeping baby, at this tiny life that had almost slipped away, saved by a body that had failed her own daughter. She thought about her attic room, about the debt she couldn't pay, about Samuel Pritchard and his father's generous offer. She thought about the bread cart and the whispers and the way the town looked through her as though she didn't exist. She thought about Rose, buried on the hill, whose 3 hours of life had taught Lena that she was capable of love so fierce it could break the world. 3 days, she said. "I'll stay 3 days until your son is strong enough to take a bottle. Then I'm coming back." Even though there was nothing to come back to, Caleb nodded, relief flooding his face. 3 days. Thank you. Someone knocked on the door, hard, insistent. "Lena Harper," Mrs. Cunningham's voice, sharp with authority. "Open this door immediately." Lena and Caleb looked at each other. "Back way?" Caleb asked quietly. Lena nodded toward the window. "Fire ladder. Leads to the alley behind the store." Caleb was already moving. Lena grabbed her shawl, the small bag where she kept what little money she had, and a clean dress folded on the chair. Nothing else. Everything else could be left behind. The knocking grew louder. Male voices now, joining Mrs. Cunningham's. Someone was trying the doorknob. Caleb pushed the window open. Cool afternoon air rushed in. He climbed through first, awkward with the baby in his arms, then reached back for Lena. She took his hand. His palm was rough, calloused, warm, and let him help her through. The fire ladder shook under their combined weight, but it held. They climbed down quickly, Lena's heart hammering, the sounds of people gathering in the hallway above them growing fainter. They reached the alley. Caleb's horse was tied to a post at the edge of the square, a sturdy roan mare with patient eyes. He mounted with practiced ease, settling his son carefully against his chest with one arm. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Not well," Lena admitted. "It's not far to the edge of town. Once we're past the church, we'll be fine." He extended his free hand down to her. "Come on, before they come looking." Lena took his hand. He pulled, she pushed, and somehow, graceless and awkward and probably scandalous, she ended up behind him on the horse, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance, her face pressed against his back. He smelled like sweat and blood and wood smoke, like grief and desperation and the kind of tired that went bone deep. He smelled human. "Hold tight," Caleb said, and kicked the horse into motion. They rode through the back alleys of Belmont, avoiding the main square. Lena caught glimpses of people turning to stare, of hands pointing, of mouths opening in shock. Let them stare, let them talk. She was already ruined. There were no depths left to fall to. They passed the church, the cemetery, the last houses clinging to the edge of civilization. And then they were in open country, riding toward Wolf Ridge, toward a ranch Lena had never seen, toward a future she couldn't predict. Behind her, the town of Belmont disappeared into the dust. Lena didn't look back. She'd stopped looking back 6 weeks ago. She was done with the past. Whatever waited ahead, whatever 3 days at a stranger's ranch might bring, it couldn't be worse than what she was leaving behind. The baby stirred against Caleb's chest, making small, sleepy sounds, sounds of contentment, of survival. Lena tightened her grip on Caleb's waist and let the rhythm of the horse carry her forward into whatever came next. The ride to Wolf Ridge took 2 hours through country that grew wilder with each mile. The road, barely more than a wagon track, climbed steadily into foothills covered with sage and prairie grass that whispered in the wind. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still holding snow even in late spring. The air smelled clean, empty of the town's mixture of commerce and judgment. Lena kept her arms wrapped around Caleb's waist, her body swaying with the horse's rhythm. The baby slept against his father's chest, peaceful now, unaware that he'd been hours from death when the sun rose that morning. Caleb rode in silence, his shoulders tight with exhaustion, and Lena didn't try to fill the quiet with conversation. Some silences were too full of grief to disturb. They crossed a creek running fast with snowmelt, the horse picking its way carefully over smooth stones, climbed a rise where juniper trees clung to rocky soil, descended into a valley where a hawk circled overhead, hunting in the golden afternoon light. And then, as they crested another low hill, Caleb pulled the horse to a stop. "There," he said quietly. Lena looked past his shoulder and saw the ranch spread out below them. It was small, a log cabin with a stone chimney, weathered but solid, a barn that leaned slightly to one side, a corral where 2 horses grazed, a chicken coop, a garden plot that looked like it hadn't been tended in weeks, weeds overtaking whatever had been planted there. Beyond the buildings, pasture land stretched toward the mountains, dotted with cattle. Maybe 20 head, which wasn't much, but it was something. It looked like the kind of place that could be beautiful with care. That had been beautiful once, before tragedy had turned it into a monument to survival instead of home. Caleb urged the horse forward, and they rode down into the valley. As they approached the cabin, Lena noticed details that confirmed what she'd suspected. Laundry still hung on a line, stiff and forgotten. A rocking chair sat on the porch, a woman's shawl draped over its back. Wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill, long dead. This was where Caleb's wife had lived, where she'd died. The horse stopped in front of the cabin. Caleb dismounted carefully, cradling his son, then reached up to help Lena down. She slid from the saddle, graceless and heavy, stumbling slightly when her feet hit the ground. Caleb steadied her with his free hand, his grip firm and impersonal. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded, already moving toward the cabin. Lena followed, taking in the ranch with a practiced eye. The place wasn't falling apart exactly, but it was neglected in the way of a home where the person who'd cared about small things, about flowers and clean laundry and swept porches, was no longer there to care. The cabin's interior was dim and cool. One large room with a kitchen area on one side, a table and chairs in the center, and a bed in the corner. A ladder led to a loft overhead. The floor was swept clean, but dust covered the table and dishes were piled in the wash basin. The air smelled stale, closed up, like no one had opened a window in days. Caleb stood in the center of the room, holding his son, looking around as though seeing the space for the first time. "I haven't—" He stopped, started again. "I've been in town for 3 days, trying to find someone who could help. The place is— I know it's not much." "It's fine," Lena said, and meant it. She'd lived in worse. "Where should I sleep?" Caleb gestured to the loft. "There's a bed up there. My wife and I—" His voice caught. "That's where we slept. I'll take the bed down here with my son. You'll have privacy." Lena nodded, grateful. She set her small bag on the table and looked around, her fingers already itching to straighten, to clean, to impose order on the chaos of grief. But this wasn't her home, and she wasn't here to judge how a man managed when his world fell apart. The baby stirred, making small sounds of distress. Caleb looked down at his son, then up at Lena, uncertainty crossing his face. "He's probably hungry again," Lena said gently, his stomach still adjusting, little and often for the next few days. Caleb nodded. He stood there awkwardly, holding his son, clearly uncertain about the protocol of asking a woman he barely knew to nurse his child in his own home. Lena made it simple. "I'll sit here," she said, moving to the rocking chair near the window. "You can put him in my arms, then step outside for a few minutes. When I'm done, I'll call you." Relief flooded Caleb's face. "Thank you." He handed her the baby with careful reverence, then walked out onto the porch, closing the door behind him. Through the window, Lena could see him standing with his back to the cabin, his shoulders slumped, staring out at the mountains. She settled the baby against her breast, unbuttoning her dress with the ease of repetition. The baby latched immediately this time, stronger than before, and Lena felt the strange mixture of pain and purpose that came with nursing. Her body was doing what it had been designed to do, finally, even if it was for someone else's child. Rose should have been the one drinking from her. Rose should have grown strong and healthy, should have become a child who laughed and played and called Lena mama. But Rose was gone, and this baby, this unnamed, almost lost boy, was here, alive because Lena's tragedy had prepared her for his. She didn't know whether to call that redemption or just another kind of grief. The baby nursed for 15 minutes before falling asleep again. Lena adjusted her clothing and called for Caleb. He came in immediately, took his son with gentle hands, and laid him carefully in a makeshift cradle near the bed, a wooden box lined with blankets, clearly built in haste. "I need to see to the animals," Caleb said, not quite meeting her eyes. "There's food in the larder if you're hungry. Not much, but help yourself to anything. I'll be back before dark." He left before Lena could respond, and she heard his boots crossing the porch, heading toward the barn. She stood in the center of the cabin, alone for the first time since she'd agreed to this madness, and tried to figure out what to do with herself. She was a guest. She shouldn't presume. But the place was a disaster, and sitting idle had never been in Lena's nature. She started with the dishes. The wash basin was full of plates and cups crusted with old food. She heated water on the stove, found soap, and scrubbed everything clean. Then she wiped down the table, swept the floor, opened the windows to let fresh air chase out the staleness. She found the dead flowers in their jar and threw them out, rinsed the jar clean, set it aside. In the larder, she discovered supplies that confirmed Caleb's claim of poverty: flour, cornmeal, a few strips of dried beef, some wrinkled potatoes, half a wheel of hard cheese. Not much, but enough to make a meal if she was creative. She put together a simple stew, using the beef and potatoes and water from the pump outside. While it simmered, she took down the forgotten laundry from the line, folding it carefully. Men's shirts, worn but clean, and smaller things that must have belonged to Caleb's wife. A dress, an apron, undergarments she didn't examine too closely. She was folding the last shirt when Caleb returned, leading his horse toward the barn. He disappeared inside, and Lena heard the sounds of hay being forked, hooves being checked, leather creaking as he removed the saddle. The ordinary sounds of ranch work, the kind of sounds Michael used to make at the end of each day. She pushed the memory away and focused on the present. By the time Caleb came back to the cabin, the sun was setting and the stew was ready. He stopped in the doorway, looking around at the clean floor, the washed dishes, the folded laundry stacked neatly on the table. His gaze moved to the pot on the stove, then to Lena, and something complicated crossed his face. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "I know." Lena stirred the stew, not looking at him. "But I can't sit idle. It's not in me." Caleb was silent for a moment. Then, "Thank you." Lena nodded toward the table. "Sit, eat. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days." "I haven't." He moved to the table, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "I've been living on coffee and whatever I could grab between trying to keep my son alive." Lena dished stew into 2 bowls and brought them to the table. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin and the baby's soft breathing from his cradle. The stew was simple, nothing special, but Caleb ate like a man who'd forgotten what real food tasted like. When he'd finished 2 bowls, he sat back and looked at her directly for the first time since they'd arrived. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "About what happened, about my wife, about why the town—" He stopped. "About why no one would help me." Lena set down her spoon. "You don't owe me anything. I'm here for your son, not for your story. You deserve to know what you've walked into." Caleb's voice was steady but tired. "Her name was Sarah. I met her last summer in Cheyenne. She was a seamstress working in a dress shop. I was there selling cattle." He paused, his hands wrapping around his empty bowl. "We talked. Just talked at first. She was kind, funny, smart. And I was lonely. This ranch has been just me for 5 years. My parents died of fever when I was 25. No siblings, no family, just me and the land and the cattle." He looked out the window at the darkening sky. "Sarah and I got married 3 weeks after we met. I knew it was fast. I knew people would talk, but she was pregnant, and she didn't have anyone either. Her parents were dead, she had no family, and it seemed like we could be something together, build something. Lena listened without comment, her hands folded in her lap. We came back here, Caleb continued, and for a while it was good. She fixed up the cabin, planted the garden, made curtains, did all the things that turn a house into a home. But she was sick a lot. The pregnancy was hard on her, and the town— His jaw tightened. The town decided we were scandalous, a hasty marriage, a woman no one knew. They whispered that she wasn't respectable, that I'd been trapped, that the baby probably wasn't even mine. Was it? Lena asked quietly. Caleb looked at her sharply. Yes, I may have married her quickly, but I'm not a fool. The timing was right. The baby is mine. His voice softened. He has her eyes. Did you notice? Gray, like mine, but shaped like hers. Lena had noticed. She nodded. 3 days ago, Sarah went into labor, Caleb said, his voice going flat, distant. I rode to town to get the midwife, Mrs. Henderson. She came, but she was cold about it, barely civil. She delivered the baby, a hard birth, lots of blood, and then she left. Told me to send for her if there were complications, but she didn't stay to make sure everything was all right. His hands clenched around the bowl. Sarah never woke up after the birth. She bled, and I couldn't stop it. I tried. God, I tried. I rode back to town for the doctor, but by the time we got back, she was gone. Dr. Marsh said there was nothing anyone could have done, that sometimes women just die in childbirth, that it's God's will. The bitterness in his voice could have stripped paint. The baby was crying, Caleb continued, screaming, hungry. I tried to get him to take a bottle, but he wouldn't. I didn't know what to do. His voice cracked. I'd never held a baby before. Didn't know how to feed one. Sarah was supposed to do that. She was supposed to be there. He stopped, breathing hard, his eyes wet. I buried her on the hill behind the cabin, he said quietly. Just me and my son and a preacher who came because I paid him to. No one else. Then I took the baby to town and started asking for help. Asked every wet nurse, every woman with a child, and they all said no. Mary Simmons said I owed her money from last year, which is a lie. I paid her in full. And she poisoned everyone else against me. Said I couldn't be trusted, that I'd probably let my wife die out of negligence, that the baby would be better off with someone respectable. He looked at Lena, and in his eyes was a fury so deep and cold it could have frozen rivers. They were going to let my son die because they decided I wasn't worth helping, because my wife wasn't respectable enough, because I'm a drifter and a debtor and not one of them. Are you? Lena asked. A debtor? Caleb's laugh was harsh. I'm behind on my mortgage. The bank owns half this ranch, and I'm 3 months overdue. But I'm not a cheat. I've never stolen, never lied. I work hard, and I pay what I owe when I have the money. But Silas Pritchard, he spat the name like a curse. Silas Pritchard has been looking for an excuse to foreclose since my father died. He wants this land. And now that Sarah's gone and the town's decided I'm not worth helping, he probably thinks he'll get it. Lena absorbed this information in silence. She thought about Samuel Pritchard's offer, about his father's generosity, about the way the bank circled people in debt like vultures waiting for death. The town wanted your son to die, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Yes. Caleb's voice was flat, certain. They wanted him to die so I'd give up and leave, so the bank could take the ranch and sell it to someone respectable, someone who belongs. He looked at her. And then you helped us. You, who they hate as much as they hate me. You, who had every reason to say no. I had my reasons for saying yes, Lena said. Your daughter. Yes. They sat in silence for a moment, two people bound by losses they couldn't undo and a town that wanted them to disappear. I need to tell you something else, Caleb said, about the next few days. The bank, Silas Pritchard sent me a letter 2 weeks ago, said I have until the end of the month to make my payment, or he's foreclosing. That's 5 days from now. Lena's stomach sank. Do you have the money? No. Caleb's voice was bleak. I was supposed to sell cattle last week, but Sarah went into labor early. I haven't had time. He stopped.
I don't have the money, which means in 5 days, I lose the ranch. I lose everything my parents built, everything I've worked for.
And my son, his voice broke. My son will grow up with nothing, with a father who couldn't even keep a roof over his head. Lena looked at this man, this stranger who'd walked into her life 6 hours ago, and saw the same desperation she'd felt every day since Michael died, the same crushing weight of trying to survive in a world that had decided you weren't worth the effort.
How much do you owe? She asked. $300? It might as well have been $3,000. Lena had $4.60. Caleb looked like he had less. Can you sell the cattle? She asked. Not in 5 days. Not for what they're worth. Pritchard knows that. He's counting on it. Caleb's hands clenched into fists. But I'll try. Tomorrow, I'll ride to the Hendersons' place. They have a big spread north of here. Maybe they'll buy a few head. Maybe I can scrape together enough to at least delay the foreclosure. And leave me here alone with your son. Caleb looked stricken. No.
I'll take him with me. I can't ask you to... He needs to eat every few hours, Lena interrupted. You ride to the Hendersons with him, and you'll have to turn back every time he's hungry. That's a full day's ride, Caleb. You can't do it with an infant. Then I'll wait until he's stronger, until he can take a bottle. In 5 days? Caleb closed his eyes. I don't know what else to do. Lena stood up and walked to the cradle. The baby was sleeping peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling with healthy rhythm. Color had returned to his face. His lips, which had been cracked and dry that morning, were pink now, alive. She'd saved this child. She'd given him a chance to live. And now she was going to watch his father lose everything because the world was cruel and banks were crueler. Unless... I'll stay, she said quietly. Tomorrow, you ride to the Hendersons. Try to sell your cattle. I'll watch your son. Keep him fed. Keep him safe. Caleb opened his eyes. You do that? Trust me to come back? Lena turned to look at him. You trusted me with your son's life when you didn't even know my name. I think I can trust you to come back to your own ranch. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, softened. Thank you, he said, and the words carried more weight than gratitude. They carried recognition, respect. The baby woke then, crying, and the conversation ended. Lena picked him up, settled into the rocking chair, and nursed him while Caleb busied himself with preparing the loft for her. He brought up clean blankets, a pillow, a lantern, made sure the space was ready, then climbed back down and gave her privacy. When the baby was fed and sleeping again, Lena climbed the ladder to the loft. The space was small but clean, with a real bed, a luxury after the narrow cot in her attic room. Through the window, she could see stars beginning to appear over the mountains, bright and clean in air that smelled like sage and pine instead of commerce and judgment. Below, she heard Caleb moving around, the creak of the rocking chair as he settled with his son, the soft sounds of a man talking to a baby in a voice too quiet to make out the words. Lena lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. This morning, she'd been selling bread in a town that despised her. Tonight, she was in a stranger's cabin, 15 miles from anywhere, having agreed to care for a baby while his father tried to save a failing ranch. It was madness. It was also the first time in 6 weeks that she'd felt like she had a purpose. She fell asleep to the sound of Caleb singing a lullaby in a voice rough with grief and hope in equal measure. Morning came cold and bright. Lena woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of someone moving around downstairs. She dressed quickly, climbed down the ladder, and found Caleb at the stove, holding his son in one arm while trying to pour coffee with the other. Here, she said, taking the baby. Sit, drink, I'll feed him. Caleb handed over his son with visible relief and sank into a chair, cradling the coffee cup like it was precious. Lena settled into the rocking chair and nursed the baby, who latched eagerly now, his strength returning with each feeding. I'm leaving as soon as he's done eating, Caleb said. Should be back before dark. If I'm not... He paused. If I'm not back by midnight, something's gone wrong. There's a rifle above the door and a shotgun in the barn. You know how to shoot? Yes. Michael had taught her, had insisted she learn, living on the edge of town with just the two of them. Caleb nodded. The Hendersons are good people, but their ranch hands can be rough. If anyone comes here while I'm gone, Don't open the door. Don't trust anyone. I won't. There's food in the larder. Not much, but enough for a day. Help yourself to anything. He paused. And Lena, if something happens to me, if I don't come back, take my son and go. Don't wait here for the bank. Just go. Nothing's going to happen to you, Lena said firmly. You don't know that. No, but I know you're not the kind of man who gives up easily. So go sell your cattle, come back, and we'll figure out what to do next. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, something like wonder crossing his face. You really believe that? I believe you're going to try. That's enough. The baby finished nursing and fell asleep. Lena handed him to Caleb, who held his son close, pressing his lips to the baby's forehead in a gesture of such tenderness it made Lena's chest ache. Thank you, Caleb said quietly, for everything, for saving his life, for giving me a chance to save mine. Then he handed the baby back to Lena, grabbed his hat, and walked out the door. She watched from the window as he saddled his horse, mounted, and rode north toward the Hendersons' ranch, becoming smaller and smaller until he disappeared into the hills. Lena was alone, with a baby who wasn't hers, in a cabin that wasn't hers, on a ranch that would probably belong to the bank in 5 days. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt something she hadn't felt in months, something almost like peace. The baby stirred in her arms, making small sounds of contentment. Lena looked down at him, this child who didn't have a name yet, who'd been hours from death yesterday, who was alive now because her tragedy had prepared her for his. You need a name, she said softly. Your father's going to come back, and you're going to need a name. The baby yawned, unconcerned with such adult matters. Lena smiled despite herself, carried him to the cradle, and laid him down gently. Then she set about making the cabin truly clean, imposing order on chaos the way she'd always done when the world felt too large and too cruel. She scrubbed, she swept, she organized. She found Sarah's sewing basket in a corner and mended a tear in one of Caleb's shirts. She weeded the garden, salvaging what could be saved. She collected eggs from the chicken coop, fed the horses, pumped water until her arms ached. She worked until the sun was high, until her dress was soaked with sweat, until the baby woke crying and she had to stop to nurse him again. And through it all, she waited for Caleb to come home. The sun had passed its peak and begun its slow descent toward the mountains when Lena heard the riders approaching. Not one horse, but several. The sound of hooves against hard ground, coming fast from the direction of town, not from the north where Caleb had gone. She was in the garden, her hands dirty with soil, the baby sleeping in his cradle, just inside the open door where she could hear him if he woke. The chickens scattered as the sound grew louder, and Lena's heart began to pound. She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron, and moved quickly to the cabin. She'd just reached the door when 5 riders crested the rise and came into view, ranch hands. She recognized the type immediately, rough men who worked for wages and drank their pay, who had more loyalty to whiskey than to any employer. They rode with the careless confidence of men who knew no one would challenge them this far from town. Lena stepped inside, closed the door, and bolted it. Her hands were shaking. She moved to the window and watched as the men rode into the yard, their horses churning up dust. They were laughing about something, passing a bottle between them. One of them, a heavy-set man with a beard that hadn't been trimmed in months, spotted her through the window. He grinned, showing gaps where teeth should have been, and said something to his companions. They all turned to look at the cabin. Lena backed away from the window. The baby was still sleeping, unaware of danger. She looked at the rifle above the door, calculating. 5 men. 1 rifle. She was a decent shot, but not good enough to hold off 5 riders if they decided to cause trouble. The heavy-set man dismounted and walked toward the cabin. His boots were loud on the porch boards. He knocked, 3 hard raps that made the door shudder in its frame. "Mrs. Moore," he called, his voice thick with false friendliness. "We know you're in there. We just want to talk." Lena said nothing. The baby stirred but didn't wake. "Come on now," the man continued. "We rode all this way. Least you could do is be neighborly. We're friends of Caleb's. He asked us to check on you while he's away." It was a lie. Lena knew it with the same certainty she knew her own name. Caleb had warned her not to trust anyone. These men weren't here to help. "Caleb's not here," she called through the door, keeping her voice steady. "And I don't need checking on. You can leave." The man laughed. "Hear that, boys? The fat lady says we can leave. More laughter from the others. Thing is, we heard something interesting in town yesterday. Heard that Caleb Moore done brought himself a woman, a big woman. Word is she's hiding out here, playing mama to his bastard baby. Lena's hands clenched. The baby's eyes opened, disturbed by the noise. She moved to the cradle and picked him up, holding him close. We don't mean no harm, the man said, his tone changing, becoming harder. But we got business with Moore. He owes money to our employer. We're here to collect on some of his property. You open this door peaceful-like, we'll take what we came for and leave you be. What employer? Lana demanded, though she already knew the answer. Mr. Silas Pritchard. The bank. Moore's 3 months behind on his mortgage, and Mr. Pritchard's decided to take what's owed in cattle. Now you can open this door, or we can open it ourselves. Your choice. The bank had sent them, not to collect payment, but to take Caleb's cattle before he could sell them. To ensure he couldn't make his mortgage, couldn't save the ranch. Lena felt fury rise in her chest, hot and sharp. You have no right, she said. Caleb has 5 days before the payment is due. You can't take his property before then. That's where you're wrong, sweetheart. Contract says if the debtor is deemed at risk of absconding with mortgaged property, the bank can seize assets immediately. And seeing as how Moore's been trying to sell his cattle, we heard about his trip to the Hendersons, Mr. Pritchard's decided he's at risk. It was legal theft dressed up in banking language. Lena had seen Michael's contracts, knew how banks wrote themselves protection against every possibility. If Caleb sold his cattle, the bank could claim he was trying to hide assets. If he didn't sell them, he couldn't make his payment. Either way, he lost. Get off this property, Lena said, her voice cold. You're trespassing. The man's patience snapped. Listen here, you fat cow. We're taking those cattle whether you like it or not. You want to make this difficult? We can make it difficult right back. Won't be our fault if you get hurt in the process. One of the other men called out, Tom, forget the woman. Let's just take the cattle and go. But Tom, the heavy-set man, wasn't finished. No, he said, and there was something ugly in his voice now. I want to see what Moore's been hiding out here. Want to see what kind of woman spreads her legs for a man whose wife ain't been dead a week. He threw his weight against the door. The bolt held, but the frame shuddered. The baby started crying, frightened by the noise. Lena backed toward the far wall, her mind racing. The rifle was above the door. She couldn't reach it without getting close to where Tom was trying to break through. The shotgun was in the barn. She had nothing but her body between these men and the baby. Tom hit the door again. Wood cracked. The bolt was giving way. Lena made a decision. She ran to the stove, grabbed the pot of coffee that had been sitting there since morning, still hot enough to scald, and positioned herself beside the door. The baby was screaming now, red-faced and terrified, but she couldn't comfort him. Not yet. Tom hit the door a third time, and the bolt broke. The door flew open and Tom stumbled inside, off balance from his momentum. Lena threw the coffee in his face. Tom screamed. His hands went to his eyes, and he fell to his knees, cursing. Lena didn't wait. She ran for the rifle, grabbed it from above the door, and spun to face the other 4 men who were now dismounting, drawn by Tom's screams. She levered around into the chamber with shaking hands and aimed at the nearest man. Stop right there, she said, her voice shaking but clear. The next person who comes through that door gets shot. The men froze. They looked at Tom, who was still on the floor, his face bright red where the coffee had burned him, tears streaming from his eyes. They looked at Lena, this fat woman in a dirty dress holding a rifle that was probably heavier than she could manage, protecting a baby that wasn't even hers. One of them started laughing. You think you can shoot all of us, lady? No, Lena said honestly, but I can shoot at least 2 of you before you reach me. Who wants to be first? The laughter stopped. The men looked at each other, calculating. Tom struggled to his feet, one hand still pressed to his burned face. You bitch, he spat. You stupid fat bitch. You're going to regret that. Get off this property, Lena repeated. All of you, now. We're taking the cattle, one of the other men said. You can't stop that. Then take them and leave. But you don't touch this cabin again. You don't touch me. And you don't touch this baby. Tom took a step toward her, rage twisting his burned face. Lena swung the rifle to point directly at his chest. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the weapon steady, but her finger was on the trigger, and they could all see she meant it. Tom, one of the other men said nervously, let's just get the cattle. This ain't worth getting shot over. Tom stared at Lena with pure hatred. You tell Moore, he said slowly, that Mr. Pritchard says he's got 3 days now, not 5. 3. And if he can't pay, we're coming back for everything. The cattle, the horses, the cabin, everything. And you, he pointed at her with a shaking hand. You better be gone by then, because next time I won't be so nice. He turned and stumbled out the door. The other men followed, mounting their horses. Lena stayed in the doorway, rifle raised, watching as they rode toward the pasture where Caleb's cattle grazed. She watched as they rounded up the animals, shouting and laughing, taking everything Caleb owned. 20 head of cattle, his only asset, his only hope of making the mortgage payment. Gone. The men drove the cattle north, back toward town, leaving only dust and destruction behind. When they were finally out of sight, Lena lowered the rifle. Her arms were trembling so badly she nearly dropped it. She set it carefully against the wall and sank to the floor, her legs giving out. The baby was still crying. She crawled to where he lay in his cradle, picked him up with shaking hands, and held him close. It's all right, she whispered, though nothing was all right. It's all right. They're gone. We're safe. But they weren't safe. Not really. In 3 days, those men would be back, and next time, Lena wouldn't be able to stop them. She sat on the floor, holding the baby, and tried not to think about what she would tell Caleb when he came home to find everything he owned had been stolen by the very bank that was supposed to wait 5 more days. The sun was setting when Lena finally heard the sound of a single horse approaching from the north. She'd cleaned up the broken door as best she could, propping it closed with a chair. She'd fed the baby twice, changed him, rocked him to sleep. She'd swept up the spilled coffee and the broken bolt. She'd done everything she could to make the cabin look less like a place where violence had nearly happened. But she couldn't hide the empty pasture. She was standing on the porch, the baby in her arms, when Caleb rode into view. He looked exhausted, but slightly hopeful. The Hendersons must have agreed to buy some cattle, and then his gaze swept the ranch and found the empty field where his herd should have been. He pulled his horse to a stop, sat perfectly still for a moment. Then he dismounted slowly and walked toward her, his eyes never leaving the empty pasture. What happened? His voice was carefully controlled. Too controlled. Lena told him. All of it. The riders from the bank, Tom breaking down the door, the coffee, the rifle, the cattle being taken. When she finished, Caleb stood in silence, his hands clenched at his sides, his jaw working. Did they hurt you? He asked finally. No. The baby? He's fine. Scared, but fine. Caleb nodded once. Then he walked past her into the cabin, looked at the broken door, the coffee stains still visible on the floor, the rifle propped against the wall. He stood in the center of the room for a long moment, and Lena saw his shoulders begin to shake. She thought he was crying. Then she realized he was laughing, a harsh, bitter sound that had nothing to do with humor. 3 days, he said. They gave me 3 days. Not even the 5 I was promised. 3 days to come up with money I don't have for cattle they already stole. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were wild, desperate. Do you know what the Hendersons offered me? $200 for 10 head, fair price, generous even. I was coming home to drive the cattle to their ranch tomorrow. I had a plan. I had hope. His voice broke on the last word. And now I have nothing. The bank wins, Pritchard wins, they all win, and He stopped, looked at the baby in Lena's arms. My son grows up with nothing, just like I promised he wouldn't. Lena walked to him and held out the baby. Caleb took his son with automatic gentleness, cradling the small weight against his chest. The baby yawned, content and oblivious to his father's despair. You still have him, Lena said quietly. They didn't take that. They will. When they foreclose, they'll take everything. The cabin, the land. I'll have nowhere to go, no way to provide for him. They'll say I'm unfit. They'll take him away and give him to some respectable family in town who can afford to feed him. Caleb's voice was flat, dead. I'll lose him too. Just like I lost Sarah. Just like I'm losing everything. No. Lena's voice was sharp, certain. No, they won't. We won't let them. Caleb looked at her like she'd lost her mind. How? Lena, I have nothing.
No cattle, no money, no way to make the payment. In 3 days, this ranch belongs to the bank, and there's nothing either of us can do about it. Lena's mind was racing. She'd spent the afternoon thinking about this, about what could be done, about what options existed when all conventional paths were closed. She'd thought about her own situation, her debt, her poverty, her complete lack of prospects. She'd thought about Caleb's desperation and the baby's innocence and the way the town had orchestrated both their destructions with casual cruelty. And she'd realized something. Sometimes the only way to win a rigged game was to change the rules entirely. "Marry me," she said. Caleb stared at her. "What?" "Marry me. Tomorrow. Ride into town, find a preacher or a judge, and marry me." Lena spoke quickly, before her courage failed. "If we're married, your debts become my debts. My income becomes your income. We become a single legal entity in the eyes of the law." "You don't have any income," Caleb said, still staring. "No, but I have something better. I have a reason for the town to care whether you keep this ranch." She took a breath. "If we're married, I'm no longer the fat widow they can ignore. I'm your wife, the woman raising your son. And if the bank forecloses on a married man with a baby, a man who's been the victim of theft by bank employees, it looks very different than foreclosing on a single drifter with questionable debts." Caleb shook his head. "It won't work. Pritchard owns the judge, owns half the town council. They won't care." "Maybe not. But there are people who will. The Hendersons offered you a fair price. That means they respect you. There are other ranchers who've dealt with Pritchard's tactics, other people who've been pushed around by the bank." Lena's voice grew stronger. "If we go into town tomorrow, publicly married, and file a complaint about the theft of your cattle, it becomes a scandal. It becomes something people have to notice." "You'd marry me for that? To cause a scandal?" "I'd marry you because your son deserves better than what this town wants to give him. Because you deserve better, and because—" Lena stopped, started again more carefully. "Because I have nothing left to lose. My reputation is already destroyed. The town already hates me. At least this way my destruction means something, helps someone." Caleb looked down at his son, then back at Lena. "You'd do that? Tie yourself legally to a man who's about to lose everything? Who has nothing to offer you but more debt and more judgment? You offered me 3 days of purpose when I had none. You trusted me with your son when no one else would. That's not nothing, Caleb." Lena's voice softened. "And maybe we can help each other. Maybe two people the town wants to destroy can be stronger together than they were apart." Caleb was silent for a long time. The baby dozed in his arms, peaceful and unaware. Outside, the sun finished setting, and the first stars appeared over the mountains. "You understand what you're suggesting," Caleb said finally. "Marriage is permanent, legal. You'd be bound to me, to this failing ranch, to all my debts. If we do this and it doesn't work, if we can't save the ranch, you'll be worse off than you are now." "I don't see how that's possible," Lena said honestly. "Right now, I'm 3 weeks behind on rent for a room I can't afford, selling bread no one buys, with a debt to a bank whose son thinks I'm desperate enough to accept his father's generous offer of sexual servitude in exchange for cleaning services. If I marry you and we lose the ranch, at least I'll have tried to do something decent. At least I won't have just—" her voice caught. "At least I won't have just disappeared without mattering to anyone." Caleb's expression changed, softened. "You matter," he said quietly. "To me, to my son. You saved his life. That matters. Then let me help you save yours." They stood in the dimming cabin, two desperate people considering a desperate plan. Finally, Caleb nodded slowly. "All right. Tomorrow morning, we ride to town. We get married, we file a complaint about the cattle, and we see what happens." "We see what happens," Lena agreed. "But Lena," Caleb's voice was serious now, "if we do this, I need you to understand something. This marriage, it would be real, legal, and binding. But it doesn't have to be—" He struggled for words. "I'm not expecting anything from you, anything improper. We can be married in name only. You'll have your own space, your own privacy. I won't. I wouldn't." "I understand," Lena said, saving him from his awkwardness. "This is a practical arrangement.
To save the ranch. To protect your son. Nothing more. Something flickered in Caleb's eyes, relief or disappointment, she couldn't tell, but he nodded. Nothing more. They ate a quiet dinner of bread and cheese, neither one with much appetite. The baby woke and needed feeding, and Lena nursed him while Caleb repaired the door as best he could with the materials he had. When the baby was fed and sleeping again, they sat at the table and planned their strategy for the morning. They would ride to town at first light, go directly to Judge Harrison. Even if Pritchard owned him, they needed the marriage recorded officially. Then to the sheriff's office to file a complaint about the stolen cattle. Then to as many ranchers and business owners as would listen, telling their story, forcing people to choose sides. It was a fragile plan. It depended on people caring about justice more than they cared about avoiding trouble, but it was the only plan they had. That night, Lena climbed to the loft and lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, she would marry a man she'd known for 2 days, a man who was about to lose everything. A man whose only hope was a fat widow the town had already decided was worthless. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt the same strange peace she'd felt yesterday. The sense that she was finally moving forward instead of just surviving. That her life, her grief, her body, her very existence was being used for something that mattered. Below, she could hear Caleb moving around, settling the baby, banking the fire. The ordinary sounds of a home preparing for sleep. Tomorrow, it would be her home too. Legally. Permanently. For better or worse. Lena closed her eyes and tried to imagine what the town would say when she and Caleb Moore rode in together, demanding to be married. She could picture the shock, the outrage, the scandalized whispers. She could picture Samuel Pritchard's face, his father's fury. Let them be furious. Let them talk. She'd been invisible for so long, maybe it was time to be impossible to ignore. She fell asleep thinking about wedding vows and cattle theft, and the way Caleb's hands had trembled when he'd held his son for the first time after the baby had been fed and saved. Morning came too quickly. Lena woke to the sound of Caleb moving around downstairs, the smell of coffee, the baby's soft crying. She dressed in her only clean dress, the one she'd packed in such a hurry 2 days ago, and braided her hair with fingers that shook only slightly. When she climbed down from the loft, she found Caleb had already fed the animals and saddled the horses. The baby was awake and fed, wrapped securely in a sling Caleb had fashioned from one of his wife's shawls. He'd shaved and put on his cleanest shirt, and he looked young and terrified and determined all at once. "Ready?" he asked. Lena took a breath. "Ready." They rode toward town together in the early morning light, two outcasts about to demand recognition from a world that wanted them to disappear. The baby slept against Caleb's chest, unaware that his entire future was about to be decided by how well his father and a woman he'd known for 3 days could convince a town to care about justice. The ride took 2 hours. Neither of them spoke much. There was nothing left to say. They'd made their choice. Now they would live with the consequences. As they crested the final hill and saw Belmont spread out below them, Lena felt her courage waver. The town looked exactly the same as it had 3 days ago, peaceful, ordinary, utterly indifferent to the dramas playing out in the lives of people it had already decided didn't matter. But then Caleb reached over and took her hand, just for a moment. A brief squeeze of solidarity and gratitude and something else she didn't have a name for. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "thank you for trying." Lena squeezed back. "Whatever happens, we face it together." They rode down into town side by side, and Lena didn't look back at the mountains or the ranch or the life she was leaving behind. She looked forward, toward the courthouse and the judge, and the moment when she would become Caleb Moore's wife, for better or for worse, in a town that wanted nothing more than to see them both destroyed. Let them try. They rode straight down Main Street at 8 in the morning, when the town was just waking up and shopkeepers were opening their doors. Lena sat tall in her saddle despite the stares, despite the way conversations stopped mid-sentence as they passed. Caleb rode beside her with his son strapped to his chest, his jaw set and his eyes forward. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building at the end of Main Street, imposing in its official permanence. They tied their horses to the rail outside, and Caleb helped Lena dismount, his hand steady on her arm. The baby was awake now, looking around with the vague curiosity of the very young. Judge Harrison usually arrives around 8:30, Caleb said quietly. We'll wait. They didn't have to wait long. Within 10 minutes, a portly man in his 60s came walking up the street, carrying a leather satchel and smoking a pipe. He saw them on the courthouse steps and his stride faltered. Recognition crossed his face, followed quickly by wariness. Caleb Moore, Judge Harrison said, his voice carefully neutral. I heard you were in some trouble. I'm in more trouble than you know, Judge, Caleb said, and I need your help. The judge looked at Lena, taking in her size, her cheap dress, the flowers still embedded under her fingernails despite her scrubbing. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or curiosity. And who is this? He asked. Lena Harper, Caleb said. My fiancée. We're here to be married. Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose. Married. Your wife has been dead less than a week. 4 days, Caleb corrected, his voice hard. 4 days in which I've watched my son nearly die, been refused help by every person in this town, and had my cattle stolen by men working for Silas Pritchard. So, yes, Judge, I'm getting married. Today, right now. Unless you're going to tell me that's illegal. The judge studied them both for a long moment. It's not illegal, he said finally. Irregular, perhaps, but not illegal. He gestured toward the courthouse door. Come inside. We'll need witnesses. We have no witnesses, Lena said quietly. Then we'll find some. Judge Harrison pushed open the heavy door and led them into the courthouse's dim interior. The main hall was empty except for a clerk arranging papers at a desk near the back. The judge called to him. Martin, I need you and Mrs. Cooper from the records office. We have a wedding to perform. Martin looked up, his eyes widening as he saw Caleb and Lena. Sir, I don't recall asking what you think, Judge Harrison said mildly. Get Mrs. Cooper, now. The clerk hurried off. Judge Harrison led them to his chambers, a wood-paneled room lined with law books and smelling of pipe smoke and old paper. He gestured for them to stand before his desk, then began pulling out the necessary forms. Before we proceed, he said, not looking up from his papers, I need to make sure you both understand what you're doing. Marriage is a legal contract. It binds your assets, your debts, your futures. Miss Harper, if you marry Mr. Moore, you become responsible for his obligations. That includes his mortgage debt to the bank. I understand, Lena said. Do you? Because Silas Pritchard is not a forgiving man. If this marriage is some attempt to delay foreclosure. It's not a delay, Caleb interrupted. It's an attempt to bring attention to theft. Yesterday, 5 men claiming to work for Pritchard came to my ranch. They broke down my door, threatened Miss Harper, and stole 20 head of cattle. My entire herd. The same cattle I was planning to sell to make my mortgage payment. Judge Harrison's pen stopped moving. He looked up sharply. They stole your cattle? Yes, sir. Said Pritchard had authorized it. Said I was at risk of absconding with mortgaged property because I'd tried to arrange a sale with the Hendersons. The Hendersons are reputable ranchers. Selling cattle to them is hardly absconding. That's what I said. But the men took the cattle anyway, drove them back toward town, left me with nothing to sell and no way to make my payment. Caleb's voice was steady, but anger simmered beneath the surface. I'm here to file a formal complaint about the theft, and I'm here to marry Miss Harper because I don't want my son growing up in a world where banks can steal from people and face no consequences. The door opened and Martin returned with a thin, severe-looking woman in her 50s, Mrs. Cooper presumably. She looked at Lena and Caleb with open disapproval. You wanted witnesses, Judge? She said. Yes, for a marriage ceremony. Please stand over there. Judge Harrison gestured to the side of the room, then turned back to Caleb and Lena. I'll ask you one more time. Are you both certain you want to do this? Lena looked at Caleb, at this man who'd been a stranger 4 days ago, who'd walked into the town square with a dying baby and desperate eyes, who'd trusted her when no one else would, who was trying to save his son and his home against odds that should have crushed him. I'm certain, she said. So am I, Caleb said. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. Very well. He opened his law book to the relevant page and began to read. We are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in matrimony. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but with full knowledge of its responsibilities and obligations. His voice continued, formal and practiced, reciting words that had joined thousands of couples before them. Lena barely heard them. She was focused on keeping her hands from shaking, on standing straight despite the way Mrs. Cooper's disapproving stare burned into her back. "Caleb Moore," the judge said, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Caleb said, his voice clear. "Lena Harper, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Lena thought about Rose buried on the hill, about Michael, who'd promised to love her forever and had meant it until a horse ended that promise, about the attic room and the debt and the town that had wanted her to disappear, about the baby in Caleb's arms who'd been saved by milk meant for a daughter who'd never grown strong enough to drink it. "I do," she said. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you husband and wife." Judge Harrison closed the book. "You may kiss the bride, if you wish." Caleb hesitated. This wasn't that kind of marriage. But appearances mattered, and they both knew it. He leaned forward carefully, mindful of the baby between them, and pressed a brief, chaste kiss to Lena's lips. His mouth was warm, uncertain, gone before she could process the contact. "Congratulations," Judge Harrison said dryly. He pulled out the marriage certificate and filled in their names with swift, practiced strokes. "Sign here, both of you, then your witnesses." Lena signed her name, Lena Moore now, not Harper, with a hand that trembled slightly. Caleb signed below her. Martin and Mrs. Cooper added their signatures as witnesses, both of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Judge Harrison blotted the ink, folded the certificate, and handed it to Caleb. "This is now a legal marriage, registered with the territorial government. Miss Harper, Mrs. Moore, is now legally responsible for your debts and entitled to any assets you possess." "Thank you, Judge," Caleb said. "Don't thank me yet. You said you wanted to file a complaint about stolen cattle." "Yes, sir." "Then let's go to the sheriff's office. You'll need to make an official statement." Judge Harrison stood, gathering his papers. "And Mrs. Moore, if you're going to be part of this fight, you should know what you're up against. Silas Pritchard has been running this town for 20 years. He owns the bank, half the businesses on Main Street, and most of the town council. Challenging him is dangerous." "More dangerous than doing nothing?" Lena asked quietly. The judge studied her for a moment, and something like respect crossed his face. "No," he admitted. "Probably not." They walked together to the sheriff's office, a small building 2 streets over from the courthouse. The morning sun was higher now, and Main Street was filling with people. Lena felt their stares like physical weight, saw the way women pulled their children closer, heard the whispers starting already. The sheriff was a lean man in his 40s named Tom Brewster, and he looked profoundly unhappy to see them. "Judge Harrison," he said warily, "what can I do for you?" "Mr. and Mrs. Moore need to file a complaint," the judge said, emphasizing the Mrs., "about a theft that occurred yesterday at their ranch." Sheriff Brewster's expression went carefully blank. "What kind of theft?" Caleb told the story again. The 5 men, Tom and his burned face, the threats, the cattle being driven away. When he finished, the sheriff was silent for a long moment. "You're saying Silas Pritchard sent men to steal your cattle," he said finally. "I'm saying 5 men came to my ranch, claimed to be working on Pritchard's orders, and took my entire herd. Whether Pritchard actually authorized it or they were acting independently, I don't know, but they invoked his name and the bank's authority." "Can you identify these men?" "One of them. Tom, I don't know his last name, big man, bearded, works as a ranch hand, I think." "Tom Barker," the sheriff said heavily. "Works for the Lazy J Ranch sometimes, drinks too much, gets in fights." He paused. "And yes, he's done work for Pritchard before, collecting debts, that sort of thing." "So you know him," Caleb said. "You can question him. Get my cattle back." Sheriff Brewster looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Moore, I understand you're upset. But if Pritchard authorized the seizure, and I'm not saying he did, but if he did, it would have been legal. Your mortgage contract probably has clauses about asset seizure if you're in default. I'm not in default yet. I have 3 days. Had 5 days, the sheriff corrected. But according to the bank, you were attempting to sell mortgaged property, which violates the terms. They moved up the deadline. That's not legal, Judge Harrison interjected. The contract specifies 5 days' notice. They can't arbitrarily change that. Take it up with Pritchard, Sheriff Brewster said. But as far as I'm concerned, this is a civil matter between Moore and the bank, not a criminal theft. They broke down my door, Caleb said, his voice rising. They threatened my wife. They took my property by force. That's not civil, Sheriff. That's criminal. Your wife? The sheriff looked at Lena as if seeing her for the first time. You married the Harper woman? I married Lena Moore, Caleb said coldly. This morning. It's registered and legal. And she was the one Tom Barker threatened yesterday. Sheriff Brewster's expression suggested he'd rather be facing a pack of wolves than this conversation. Look, I'll talk to Tom. Ask him about what happened. But unless you have proof that Pritchard didn't authorize the cattle removal, there's not much I can do. Then get me proof, Caleb demanded. Go to the bank. Ask Pritchard directly if he sent those men. I can't just walk into Silas Pritchard's office and accuse him of cattle theft. Why not? Lena asked quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. She met the sheriff's gaze steadily. If a poor rancher came to you saying his cattle had been stolen, you'd investigate. Why is it different when the accused is rich? Sheriff Brewster's face flushed. Mrs. Moore, you don't understand how things work in this town. I understand perfectly. The bank wants my husband's ranch. The bank sent men to ensure he couldn't make his mortgage payment. And now the law is choosing to look the other way because investigating would be inconvenient. Lena's voice was calm, but steel ran through it. That's exactly how things work. The question is whether you're going to do your job anyway. The sheriff and Lena stared at each other. Judge Harrison watched with barely concealed interest. Caleb held his son close, waiting. Finally, Sheriff Brewster sighed. I'll talk to Pritchard, ask him about the cattle, but I'm not making any promises. That's all we ask, Judge Harrison said smoothly. An honest investigation. Now, if you'll excuse us, Mr. and Mrs. Moore have other business to attend to. They left the sheriff's office and stood on the street, the morning sun bright and merciless. People were openly staring now, gathering in small groups to whisper and point. Lena saw Mrs. Cunningham across the street, her face twisted with disapproval. Saw Samuel Pritchard emerging from the bank, his expression darkening as he recognized them. That went about as well as expected, Judge Harrison said, which is to say, not well at all. Sheriff Brewster won't do anything unless he's forced to, and Silas Pritchard certainly won't admit to authorizing cattle theft. So what do we do? Caleb asked. You make noise. You tell everyone who'll listen what happened. You make this story impossible to ignore. The judge paused. And you prepare for the fact that in 3 days you might lose your ranch anyway. I know, Caleb said quietly. Judge Harrison looked at them both. This desperate young couple who'd just married out of necessity and defiance in equal measure, and shook his head. For what it's worth, I think what you're doing is brave. Stupid, perhaps, but brave. This town needs more people willing to stand up to Pritchard's bullying. He tipped his hat to Lena. Good luck, Mrs. Moore. You're going to need it. He walked away, leaving them standing in the street with their baby and their new marriage and their almost certain doom. What now? Lena asked. Now we go to the mercantile, Caleb said. Buy supplies. Let people see us together. Let the gossip spread. The more people who know what happened, the harder it will be for Pritchard to pretend he didn't order the theft. They walked down Main Street together, and it felt like running a gauntlet. Every eye was on them. Every conversation stopped as they passed. Lena heard the whispers clearly now, no longer bothering to hide their cruelty. Married her for her body, probably. Needs a wet nurse and a cook. Poor Sarah barely cold in the ground. That Harper woman always was shameless. Wonder how long before he realizes what a mistake he made. Lena kept her head high and her hand on Caleb's arm, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Beside her, Caleb's jaw was tight, but he walked steadily, the baby content against his chest. They entered the mercantile, and the conversations inside died instantly. Mr. Garrett, who owned the store and the attic room Lena could no longer afford, looked up from his ledger with obvious shock. "Lena," he said, "I didn't expect to see you here." "It's Mrs. Moore now," Caleb said pleasantly. "We were married this morning. We're here to buy supplies." Mr. Garrett's gaze moved between them, calculating. "You're still 3 weeks behind on your room rent." "Send the bill to our ranch," Caleb said. "We'll settle all debts when we can." "When you can?" "More. The whole town knows you're about to lose your ranch. You can't pay your mortgage. You certainly can't pay her debts." "Her debts are my debts now," Caleb said. "That's how marriage works. But before you get too excited about collecting, you should know that we've just filed a formal complaint with the sheriff about the theft of my cattle. 20 head, stolen yesterday by men claiming to work for Silas Pritchard. I had a buyer lined up, would have made my mortgage payment with money to spare." Mr. Garrett's expression changed. "Tom Barker and his crew? You know about it?" "Everyone knows. They drove the cattle right through town yesterday afternoon, said they were acting on bank orders." The storekeeper paused. "Said you were trying to hide assets." "I was trying to sell assets to pay my legal debt. There's a difference." Caleb's voice was hard. "And when those men broke into my home and threatened my wife, they committed a crime. The sheriff's investigating now." It was an exaggeration. Brewster had promised to ask questions, not actually investigate, but it sounded official. Mr. Garrett looked uncertain. "Look," he said finally, "I'm sorry about your cattle. I truly am. Barker's a brute, and if he scared your wife, that's wrong. But business is business. Lena's room debt is real money that I'm owed, and we'll pay it," Lena said quietly. "When we can. But right now we need supplies to get through the next few days. Flour, cornmeal, coffee. We'll take what we can carry and settle the bill later. I can't just give you supplies on credit, not with your financial situation." "Then we'll pay cash," Caleb said. He pulled out a small leather pouch and counted out coins onto the counter. "This is what we have, $12.40. We'll take whatever that buys." It was probably every cent Caleb had in the world. Mr. Garrett looked at the money, then at them, clearly torn between profit and prudence. Finally, he sighed and began gathering supplies. Flour, cornmeal, coffee, sugar, dried beans, salt, a small bag of hard candy that he threw in without charging. "For the baby," he said gruffly. "When he's old enough." They packed the supplies into saddlebags, thanked Mr. Garrett, and left. Outside, the crowd had grown. At least 20 people now, gathered to watch the spectacle of Caleb Moore and his scandalous new wife. And standing at the center of the crowd, looking like a thundercloud about to break, was Silas Pritchard. He was a tall man in his 60s, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that spoke of wealth and authority. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his beard precisely trimmed. He looked like respectability incarnate, and his eyes when they landed on Caleb and Lena were cold with fury. "Moore," he said, his voice carrying across the street. "I heard you got married. Congratulations. Though I'm surprised you could find anyone desperate enough to take on your debts." Caleb's hand tightened on the saddlebag, but his voice stayed level. "Mr. Pritchard, I was hoping to see you. I need to discuss the cattle that were stolen from my ranch yesterday." "Stolen?" Pritchard's eyebrows rose in theatrical surprise. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. My men were simply collecting on property that's technically owned by the bank, since you're in default on your mortgage." "I'm not in default. Not yet. I have 3 days." "You had 5 days," Pritchard corrected smoothly. "But when I learned you were attempting to sell mortgaged property without the bank's permission, I exercised my right under the contract to accelerate the timeline. You now have until end of business tomorrow to make your full payment. After that, the property, including all livestock, reverts to the bank." "Tomorrow?" Caleb's voice rose. "You can't just change the deadline." "I can, and I have. It's all legal, I assure you. Judge Harrison can confirm the contract language if you'd like." Pritchard's smile was thin and sharp. "Of course, if you'd like to negotiate a payment plan, I'm always willing to discuss reasonable terms with reasonable people." "What terms?" Lena asked. Pritchard's gaze moved to her, and his expression hardened with distaste. "Mrs. Moore, How unexpected to see you elevated to such respectability. Your husband must be truly desperate." He paused. The terms would be simple. Moore signs the ranch over to the bank in exchange for forgiveness of the full debt. He keeps his cattle, assuming they can be located, and walks away with a clean slate, free to start over somewhere else. "Somewhere else," Caleb repeated flatly. "You want me to give you my ranch, my home, everything my parents built, and just leave?" "I'm offering you a way out of this situation with your dignity intact. It's more than most debtors get." Pritchard's voice hardened. "You have until tomorrow, Moore. Make the payment in full, or lose everything. Those are your options." "What about the theft?" Lena demanded. "Your men broke into our home, threatened me, took our property by force. That's not legal collection. That's a crime." Pritchard turned to her with a look of such condescension it made her skin crawl. "Mrs. Moore, I understand you're new to your husband's situation, but I assure you everything my employees did was entirely legal and within the bounds of standard debt collection practices. If you felt threatened, I apologize. But collecting on a mortgage is not a crime. Breaking down a door is. I'm sure there's been some exaggeration. Tom Barker can be enthusiastic in his work, but he knows the law." Pritchard looked around at the gathered crowd, playing to them now. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're witnessing a desperate man making desperate accusations. Mr. Moore knows he can't pay his debt, so he's trying to paint the bank as the villain. It's unfortunate, but not uncommon." Several people in the crowd nodded. Mrs. Cunningham was smiling. Samuel Pritchard looked smug. But not everyone was convinced. Lena saw doubt on some faces. Discomfort. A few people who'd clearly dealt with Pritchard's standard debt collection practices and knew they weren't as civilized as he claimed. "I'm not making accusations," Caleb said, his voice ringing clear. "I'm stating facts. Your men came to my ranch. They broke my door. They threatened my wife while I was away. And they took my cattle, the same cattle I'd arranged to sell to the Hendersons for a fair price, which would have let me make my payment with money to spare. That's not coincidence, Pritchard. That's sabotage." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Pritchard's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Anger, barely controlled. "Prove it," he said softly. "Prove that I ordered any such thing. Prove that my men did anything beyond their legal authority. You can't, because it didn't happen the way you're claiming." He straightened his jacket. "Tomorrow, Moore. Payment in full, or get off my property." He turned and walked away, the crowd parting for him like water. Several people followed him, clearly siding with wealth and power over a desperate rancher and his fat wife. But others stayed, and some of them looked troubled. An older rancher Lena didn't know approached Caleb carefully. "Moore," he said quietly. "I'm Ben Henderson. We met when you came asking about buying cattle." "Mr. Henderson." Caleb's face showed surprise. "I didn't expect—" "I heard what Pritchard's men did. My foreman saw them driving your herd through Henderson Pass yesterday, and he thought it was odd. You'd told me you'd drive them to our ranch yourself." Henderson paused. "I came to town today specifically to find you, to say that if you need a witness that you had a legitimate buyer, I'll testify to it." Hope flared in Caleb's eyes. "You will?" "I don't like bullies, and I don't like banks that use legal tricks to steal land. If there's anything I can do to help, I will." Henderson glanced at Lena. "Congratulations on your marriage, by the way. Your wife's got courage standing up to Pritchard like that." "Thank you," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Henderson tipped his hat and walked away. Another man stepped forward, younger, dressed in working clothes. "Mr. Moore, I'm David Wright. I don't have much, but I know what it's like to be on the wrong side of the bank. If you need help, if you need anything, my family will do what we can." More people came forward after that. Not many, maybe 7 or 8 in total, but enough. Enough to show that not everyone in town was willing to watch Pritchard destroy a man for profit. Enough to give Caleb and Lena a fragile thread of hope. When the crowd finally dispersed, Caleb and Lena stood alone in the street with their supplies and their baby and their impossible situation. "We have until tomorrow," Caleb said quietly. "One day to come up with $300 or lose everything." "We made noise," Lena said. "We got witnesses. We got people thinking. That's something. It's not money. No, but it's not nothing either. They rode back to the ranch in silence, both of them exhausted by the morning's drama. The baby slept peacefully, unaware that his home hung by a thread. When they arrived, the empty pasture greeted them like an accusation. Caleb dismounted and helped Lena down, then stood looking at the cabin with an expression of such profound weariness it broke her heart. "I'm going to lose it," he said. "Everything. Tomorrow, Pritchard will come with the sheriff and legal papers, and I won't be able to stop him. And you," he looked at her, "you tied yourself to this disaster, married me knowing I'd probably lose everything. I'm sorry, Lena. I'm so sorry." Lena took his hand. "Don't apologize for giving me a chance to matter, to do something that meant something, even if it fails. It's not fair to you. Life hasn't been fair to either of us." She squeezed his hand. "So we face tomorrow together, whatever comes." They went inside and Lena made dinner while Caleb tended the animals. The baby woke and needed feeding, and Lena nursed him in the rocking chair, watching through the window as Caleb worked in the fading light. This man was her husband now, legally bound to her, in debt and in struggle. It wasn't the marriage she'd imagined having, back when she'd been young and Michael had promised her forever. But it was real, and it mattered. And tomorrow, when Silas Pritchard came to take everything, she would stand beside Caleb and refuse to let him face it alone. That night, they sat at the table after dinner, the baby asleep in his cradle, and tried to find solutions where none existed. They counted their remaining money, $8.16. They discussed selling the horses, the furniture, anything that might bring in cash. But nothing would bring in $300 by tomorrow. "What will you do?" Lena asked finally. "When Pritchard forecloses?" Caleb was silent for a long time. "I don't know. Find work somewhere, I suppose. Try to save enough to start over. Maybe go to California." He looked at the baby. "Raise him as best I can." "And me?" He looked up sharply. "What about you? We're married, Caleb. Where you go, I go. That's how this works. You didn't sign up for California. You signed up for 3 days of helping with my son. I signed up for marriage, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer." Lena's voice was steady. "I meant those vows, even if they were spoken out of desperation. So wherever you go, whatever you do, you're not doing it alone." Caleb stared at her, something complicated working across his face. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why would you do that? You could leave, go back to town, tell everyone I abandoned you. You'd be free of my debts, free of this disaster." "And go back to what? My attic room that I can't pay for? My bread cart that nobody buys from? At least here, with you, I have purpose. I have—" She stopped. "I have someone who sees me as a person instead of just a burden taking up space." "You were never a burden," Caleb said quietly. "You saved my son's life. You married me to help fight the bank. You've done nothing but give, Lena, and I've given you nothing but more trouble. You gave me a chance. That's not nothing." They sat in the quiet cabin, two people who'd married out of necessity, discovering something neither had expected. Not love. It was too soon for that, too complicated. But connection, partnership, the knowledge that they were stronger together than apart. "Tomorrow," Caleb said finally, "when Pritchard comes, I want you to take the baby and go inside. Don't watch. Don't try to fight. Just keep my son safe. Let me handle the rest." "No," Lena said. "Lena, no. We face it together, or we don't face it at all. I'm your wife. I stand beside you." Her voice was firm. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we meet it side by side." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and then, slowly, he smiled. It was a sad smile, full of grief for what they were about to lose, but it was real. "Side by side," he agreed. They went to bed that night, Caleb on the bed downstairs with his son, Lena in the loft, knowing that tomorrow would bring either salvation or destruction. There was no middle ground, no room for half measures. Lena lay awake for hours, listening to the sound of Caleb moving around below, unable to sleep. She heard him talk to his son in quiet tones, heard him walking outside, checking the property one last time, heard him finally settle into bed around midnight, the springs creaking under his weight, and still she couldn't sleep. Because tomorrow, everything would change. and she had no idea if they were strong enough to survive it. Dawn came cold and clear, the sky the color of steel. Lena woke to the sound of riders approaching, multiple horses, moving fast. She climbed down from the loft to find Caleb already awake, standing at the window with the rifle in his hands and his son sleeping peacefully in the cradle, unaware that everything was about to end.
"How many?" she asked quietly.
6,
"Maybe 7. Caleb's voice was flat. "Pritchard brought an army." Lena moved to stand beside him. Through the window she could see the riders cresting the hill, Silas Pritchard in the lead, Sheriff Brewster beside him, and behind them a collection of men she recognized. Tom Barker, with his burned face. Samuel Pritchard. 2 men in suits who were probably bank lawyers, and bringing up the rear, Judge Harrison, looking grim. "The judge came," Lena said, surprised. "Probably to make sure everything's legal, to witness the foreclosure." Caleb set the rifle aside. "No point in shooting, they have the law on their side." Then we faced them with the truth. They walked out onto the porch together as the riders entered the yard. Pritchard dismounted with practiced ease, brushing dust from his expensive coat. Sheriff Brewster followed, looking uncomfortable. The others formed a semicircle, and Lena felt the weight of their judgment like a physical thing. "More," Pritchard said without preamble. "Do you have the $300 you owe the bank?" "You know I don't," Caleb said quietly. "Your men made sure of that when they stole my cattle. We've been over this. The cattle were legally seized. You had every opportunity to make your payment on time." Pritchard pulled out a sheaf of papers. "I have here the foreclosure documents signed by Judge Harrison, transferring ownership of this property to the bank effective immediately. You have until noon to vacate the premises." "Noon?" Lena said sharply. "That's 3 hours." "That's generous, Mrs. Moore. Most foreclosures allow for immediate eviction." Pritchard's smile was cold. "But I'm not without sympathy. You'll need time to pack your belongings and make arrangements." "Where exactly do you expect us to go?" Caleb demanded. "I have a week-old son, my wife, no money,
"No property. What are we supposed to do?" "That's not my concern. You should have thought about that before you defaulted on your loan." Judge Harrison cleared his throat. "Actually, Silas, there's a complication." Pritchard turned to him, irritation flickering across his face. "What complication?" "Mr. and Mrs. Moore filed a formal complaint about the cattle seizure. Sheriff Brewster was supposed to investigate." The judge looked at the sheriff. "Did you speak with Tom Barker as you promised?" Sheriff Brewster shifted uncomfortably. "I did. Tom says he was acting on bank orders, said Pritchard himself authorized the seizure to prevent Moore from hiding assets." All eyes turned to Pritchard. The banker's expression remained calm, but Lena saw his jaw tighten. "I authorized the legal collection of mortgaged property. If Tom's methods were overly aggressive, that's unfortunate, but it doesn't change the fundamental legality of the action." "He broke down their door," Judge Harrison said mildly. "Threatened Mrs. Moore while she was alone with an infant. Those aren't standard collection practices, Silas." "I wasn't there. I can't speak to what happened." "Then perhaps Tom can." The judge gestured, and Tom Barker stepped forward, his burned face still angry red. "Mr. Barker, did Mr. Pritchard give you specific instructions about how to handle the Moore situation?" Tom glanced at Pritchard nervously. "I was told to collect the cattle, to make sure Moore couldn't sell them before the bank took possession." "And did Mr. Pritchard instruct you to break down doors or threaten anyone?" "He said to do whatever was necessary." Tom's voice was defensive. "Said Moore was trying to cheat the bank and we needed to act fast." "Did he tell you to be gentle about it?" Judge Harrison pressed. Tom scowled. "No, he said Moore was a debtor, and debtors don't deserve gentle treatment." A muscle jumped in Pritchard's jaw. "That's not what I said." "It's exactly what you said," Tom shot back, his burned face twisting with resentment. "You said, make him understand what happens to people who don't pay their debts. You said, don't be soft. So I wasn't soft. I did what you paid me to do." The silence that followed was profound. Even Samuel Pritchard looked uncomfortable. Sheriff Brewster was staring at the ground. Judge Harrison turned to Pritchard. "Would you like to revise your statement about not knowing what happened, Silas?" Pritchard's eyes were cold with fury, but his voice remained controlled. "Tom misunderstood his instructions.
I never authorize violence or property damage. If he exceeded his authority, that's his responsibility, not mine." "Convenient," Caleb said quietly. "You send men to do your dirty work, then claim ignorance when they do exactly what you wanted. Watch your tone, Moore. You're already in enough trouble." "Am I?" "Because it seems like you're the one in trouble now."
Caleb's voice grew stronger. "You sent men to my ranch to steal my cattle and ensure I couldn't make my payment. You accelerated the foreclosure timeline to prevent me from selling assets. You've been trying to force me off this land since my father died, and now you've been caught doing it illegally." "Prove it," Pritchard snapped. "Prove I did anything illegal. You can't, because everything I've done is within the bounds of the law." "Maybe not everything," a new voice said. Everyone turned. Ben Henderson was riding into the yard, and behind him were at least 15 other ranchers and townspeople. David Wright, Mr. Garrett from the Mercantile, several men Lena didn't recognize, even Mrs. Henderson riding side saddle with quiet dignity. "Mr. Henderson," Judge Harrison said, surprise evident in his voice, "what brings you here?" "I heard Pritchard was foreclosing on the Moore place today. Wanted to see it for myself." Henderson dismounted and walked to stand beside Caleb and Lena. "Also wanted to make sure everyone knows that Caleb Moore had a buyer for his cattle. Me. We had an agreement. Fair price to be paid on delivery, which means if those cattle hadn't been stolen, Moore would have made his payment with money to spare." "That's irrelevant now," Pritchard said. "The deadline has passed." "Has it?" Henderson pulled out a pocket watch. "It's 9 in the morning. You said noon. That's 3 hours away. Seems to me if Moore can come up with the money before noon, the foreclosure shouldn't proceed." "He doesn't have the money. He just admitted as much." "No, but I do." Henderson pulled out a leather wallet. "I'm prepared to loan Caleb Moore $300, interest-free, to be repaid when he sells me his cattle, which I'm still willing to buy at the agreed price." Pritchard's face went red. You can't what? Loan money to a neighbor?" "Pretty sure that's legal, Silas." Henderson counted out bills onto a nearby fence post. $300. U.S. currency. Legal tender. More than enough to satisfy Moore's debt. "This is collusion," Pritchard sputtered. "You're deliberately interfering with a legal foreclosure." "I'm helping a neighbor who was the victim of theft. There's a difference." Henderson looked at the judge. "Am I allowed to loan money to Mr. Moore, or has that suddenly become illegal?" Judge Harrison was trying not to smile. "It's perfectly legal, Mr. Henderson. Though I should point out that if Mr. Moore accepts this loan, he'll owe you $300 instead of owing the bank. I trust him to pay me back. Unlike some people, I don't think a man's word is worthless just because he's had a run of bad luck." Henderson turned to Caleb. "What do you say, Moore? You want this loan?" Caleb was staring at the money like he couldn't quite believe it was real. Yes, sir. Thank you. I'll pay you back, every cent, with interest. No interest. Just pay me when you can, and we'll call it square." Henderson picked up the bills and handed them to Caleb. "Now I believe you have a payment to make." Caleb turned to Pritchard, the money clutched in his hand. $300. Full payment of my mortgage debt, before the deadline. He held out the bills. "Take it." Pritchard didn't move. His face was a mask of barely controlled rage. "This isn't over, Moore." "Actually it is," Judge Harrison said. "Mr. Moore has made his payment in full, before the deadline you yourself set. The foreclosure is null and void." He pulled out the documents Pritchard had brought and tore them cleanly in half. "These are no longer valid." "You can't do that," Samuel Pritchard protested. "The debt is paid," the judge said flatly. "The mortgage stands. The Moores keep their property, unless you'd like to argue that U.S. currency isn't sufficient payment." Pritchard's hands were shaking with fury. "This is a farce. You're all conspiring against me." "No, Silas, we're just tired of watching you bully people." Judge Harrison's voice was cold. "And while we're on the subject of legality, I'm ordering Sheriff Brewster to investigate the cattle theft properly. Tom Barker just admitted you ordered him to use aggressive tactics. That's worth looking into." "I did no such thing," Pritchard snapped. "We all heard him say it," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. "Every person here is a witness." Pritchard looked around at the crowd, at the ranchers and townspeople who'd come to support the Moors, who were watching him with expressions ranging from distrust to outright hostility. For the first time since he'd arrived, he seemed to realize he was outnumbered. "This isn't over," he said again, but the words had no force now. He mounted his horse stiffly. "Come on, Samuel. We're leaving." "But father—" "Now, Samuel." The Pritchards rode away, Tom Barker and the bank lawyers following. They left in a cloud of dust and humiliation, and when they were gone, the people who remained erupted in quiet celebration. Ben Henderson clapped Caleb on the shoulder. "You did good standing up to him. Took courage." "I couldn't have done it without you. Without all of you." Caleb looked at the assembled crowd, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. All of you. You saved my home, my son's future. I don't know how to repay that." "You can start by selling me those cattle," Henderson said with a smile. "Once the sheriff finishes investigating and returns them, of course." Sheriff Brewster cleared his throat. "About that. I'll need to officially seize the cattle as evidence while I investigate the theft claim. But assuming I confirm they were taken illegally, and Tom's testimony makes that pretty clear, they'll be returned to you within a week." "And then?" Caleb asked. "Then you sell them to me, pay back the loan, and start fresh." Henderson extended his hand. "Sound fair?" Caleb shook it firmly. "More than fair. Thank you." The crowd began to disperse, people offering congratulations and support as they left. Mr. Garrett pulled Lena aside. "About your room debt," he said quietly. "Consider it forgiven. You stood up to the Pritchards when most people wouldn't. That's worth more than a few weeks' rent." Lena felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you. Thank you. This town needs more people with courage." He tipped his hat and walked away. Soon only Judge Harrison remained. He approached Caleb and Lena with a thoughtful expression. "You two make quite a team," he said. "Married for less than 24 hours, and you've already brought down Silas Pritchard's empire a few notches." "Is he really done?" Lena asked. "Or will he come after us again?" "He'll try. Men like Pritchard don't give up easily. But you've made powerful allies today, and you've exposed his tactics publicly. That limits what he can do." The judge paused. "Of course, you'll need to be careful. Pay your mortgage on time. Keep your debts clear. Don't give him any legitimate reason to come after you." "We will," Caleb promised. "We'll do everything right from now on." Judge Harrison smiled. "See that you do, and Mrs. Moore." He turned to Lena. "You did well yesterday, speaking up to the sheriff, standing beside your husband. This town could use more women willing to demand justice instead of just accepting how things are." "Thank you, Judge," Lena said quietly. He rode away, leaving Caleb and Lena standing in their yard, the baby stirring in the cabin behind them, the sun climbing higher in a sky that suddenly seemed full of possibility instead of doom. "We did it," Caleb said wonderingly. "We actually did it. We saved the ranch." "You saved it," Lena corrected. You stood beside me. You married me when you had every reason not to. You faced down Pritchard and the sheriff and the whole damn town." Caleb turned to her, and in his eyes was something warm and grateful and real. "You saved me, Lena. You and our son. You gave me a reason to keep fighting when I wanted to give up." "Our son. Not his son. Our son." The words settled into Lena's chest like a homecoming. "He needs a name," she said softly. "We can't keep calling him the baby." Caleb looked toward the cabin where his son was beginning to cry, hungry and insistent. "I've been thinking about that. Sarah wanted to name him after my father if he was a boy, James Michael Moore." "Michael," Lena repeated, thinking of her own Michael, her first husband. "That's a good name. You don't mind?" I know your husband. I don't mind. It's a good, strong name. And if it honors your father and my Michael both, that seems right." She paused. "Our families are part of him, even if they're gone. We carry them forward." The baby's crying grew louder. Lena smiled. "I should feed him. James is hungry." She walked into this cabin, and Caleb followed. She settled into the rocking chair and unbuttoned her dress, and Caleb handed her their son, James, with gentle reverence. The baby latched immediately, no longer weak and struggling, but strong and healthy, and Lena felt the familiar ache that was both pain and purpose. Caleb sat at the table, watching them. "I need to say something," he said quietly, "about our marriage, about what happens now." Lena looked up, her heart suddenly uncertain. "What about it?" "When I asked you to marry me, when we agreed to this, it was practical. A legal arrangement to save the ranch. We both understood that." Caleb's voice was careful. "And I want you to know that I still honor that understanding. I'm not expecting, I won't demand anything from you that wasn't part of our agreement. Your privacy, your space, your independence, those are still yours." "I know," Lena said softly, "but I also need you to know that in these past few days you've become—" He stopped, searching for words. "You've become important to me. Not just because you saved James, not just because you helped fight the bank, but because you're brave and kind and you see people, really see them, in a way most people don't." Lena's throat tightened. "Caleb, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I'm just saying that if you want this marriage to be more than a legal arrangement, if you want to try to build something real together, I would like that. But if you don't, if you want to keep things as they are, I'll respect that too." James finished nursing and fell asleep in Lena's arms. She adjusted her dress carefully, then looked at Caleb directly. "When I married you, I thought I was doing it for practical reasons, to help you fight the bank, to give myself purpose. But somewhere in these past few days, it stopped being just practical." Caleb's breath caught. "I don't know if it's love," Lena continued honestly. "It's too soon for that. We barely know each other, but it's something. Partnership, connection. The feeling that I belong somewhere for the first time since Michael died." She paused. "I'd like to try, Caleb, to build something real, to be a real family, not just a legal arrangement." Caleb crossed the room and knelt beside the rocking chair. He took her free hand, the one not supporting the baby, and held it gently. "Then we'll try. Together. No expectations except honesty and effort." "Together," Lena agreed. He leaned forward and kissed her, and this time it wasn't the brief, uncertain kiss of their wedding. It was real, warm, full of possibility and promise and the knowledge that they were both choosing this, choosing each other, with open eyes and hopeful hearts. When they pulled apart, James stirred between them, making small sounds of protest at being jostled. They both laughed, and Caleb took his son carefully, cradling him against his chest. "Welcome home, James," he said softly. "Welcome to your family. Your mother and father who fought the whole world to keep you safe." Lena's eyes filled with tears. Mother. He'd called her James's mother, not wet nurse, not caretaker. Mother. "I'll do my best," she whispered, touching the baby's soft hair. "I'll try to be worthy of that." "You already are," Caleb said. "You already are." The weeks that followed were busy and full. Sheriff Brewster completed his investigation and officially returned the cattle, though Tom Barker disappeared before he could be arrested for assault and theft. Silas Pritchard quietly paid a fine for improper debt collection practices, and while he remained powerful in town, his reputation was tarnished. People whispered about his tactics. Some of his debtors, emboldened by the Moors' victory, began questioning their own contracts. Caleb sold the cattle to Ben Henderson for the agreed price, paid back the loan, and made his mortgage payment with money left over for supplies and improvements. He hired David Wright to help with ranch work, and together they rebuilt the barn, repaired fences, and prepared for spring planting. Lena transformed the cabin from a place of grief and desperation into a home. She sewed curtains from fabric. Mr. Garrett sold her at cost, planted a garden that actually thrived, cooked meals that filled the cabin with warmth and the smell of bread and stew and coffee. She fed James every few hours, watched him grow stronger and healthier, and marveled at how a baby who'd been hours from death was now thriving, hitting every milestone with determined vigor. At night, she and Caleb talked about their pasts, their losses, their hopes for the future, about Michael and Sarah keeping their memories alive without letting grief consume them, about building a ranch that could support a family, about maybe, someday, having more children to fill the cabin with noise and life. They shared a bed now, in the loft that had been Lena's alone. It had happened gradually, naturally, born of cold nights and the desire for comfort and connection. They learned each other slowly, the landscape of scars and soft places, the language of touch and trust. Caleb was gentle with her in a way no one had been since Michael died, treating her body as something worthy of care rather than judgment. And Lena, who'd spent 2 years being invisible, learned what it meant to be seen, to be wanted, to matter to someone not despite her size but simply as herself. 3 months after their desperate wedding, Lena stood in the garden, pulling weeds while James slept in a basket in the shade nearby. The summer sun was warm on her shoulders, and she could hear Caleb working in the barn, his voice carrying as he talked to the horses. She paused to wipe sweat from her forehead and looked around at the ranch, at the neat cabin with its new curtains, the thriving garden, the repaired barn, the cattle grazing peacefully in the pasture. At James sleeping contentedly, his tiny fists curled beside his face. This was her home, her family, her life. She'd come here 4 months ago as a desperate widow with nothing to lose, agreeing to nurse a stranger's baby for 3 days. She'd stayed because running had seemed easier than returning to a town that wanted her to disappear. But somewhere along the way, running had turned into staying, surviving had turned into living. A practical arrangement had turned into love. Not the passionate, overwhelming love of storybooks. Something quieter, steadier, built on shared hardship and mutual respect and the daily choice to be kind to each other, even when life was hard. It was enough. More than enough. Caleb emerged from the barn and walked toward her, his shirt stained with honest work, his face tanned from the sun. He looked healthier than he had that first desperate day in the town square, like a man who'd found reasons to live instead of just reasons to survive. "James still sleeping?" he asked. "Like the dead," Lena said, then winced at her choice of words. Caleb smiled. "He's earned it. Kept us up half the night with his fussing." "He's teething. It'll pass." Caleb moved behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. Lena leaned into him, comfortable with the casual intimacy that had grown between them. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about expanding the herd, maybe buying some breeding stock from the Hendersons. If we're going to make this ranch work long-term, we need to grow." "That sounds good. We'd need to repair the south fence first." "I know. David and I can handle that next week." He paused. "I also thought maybe this fall we could go into town, to the church, have a real wedding, with guests and a celebration. Let the town see that we're not just a desperate arrangement anymore." Lena turned in his arms to face him. "You want a real wedding?" "I want people to know that you're my wife because I chose you, because you're remarkable and brave and the best thing that ever happened to me and James." His voice was serious. "I want to stand up in front of everyone and say vows that mean something, Lena. Not because we're trying to save a ranch, but because we're building a life." Tears filled Lena's eyes. "I'd like that. A real wedding, a real choice. Then we'll do it. September, maybe. After harvest. We'll invite the whole town, even the people who wanted us to fail, and show them what we've built." He kissed her forehead gently. "Show them that sometimes the people they throw away are the ones who build the strongest foundations." James woke then, crying for attention and food. Lena picked him up, settling him against her hip with practiced ease. He'd grown so much in 4 months, from a dying infant to a healthy, curious baby with his father's gray eyes and his mother's determination. "He looks like you," Caleb said, watching them together. "He looks like Sarah," Lena corrected gently. "He looks like both of you. His mother who gave birth to him, and his mother who saved his life." Caleb touched James's cheek softly. "He's lucky to have had 2 mothers who loved him, even if one of them is gone." They walked back to the cabin together, husband, wife, and son, as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. Inside, Lena fed James while Caleb started dinner, the two of them moving around each other with the comfortable rhythm of people who'd learned to work together. That night, after James was asleep in his cradle and dinner was finished and the dishes were washed, Caleb and Lena sat on the porch watching stars emerge over the mountains. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and pine and the promise of rain. "Do you ever regret it?"
Caleb asked quietly. Marrying me? Staying here? Lena thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved. She thought about her life before. The attic room, the bread cart, the crushing weight of invisibility. She thought about Rose, buried on the hill in town, whose brief life had taught Lena that grief could coexist with purpose. No, she said finally. I don't regret it. This life is hard, but it's real, and I'd rather have a hard, real life with you than an easy, empty life alone. Even when James keeps us up all night teething, especially then, she smiled. Those are the moments that matter, the hard ones. The ones that prove we're alive. And together, and building something that will last. Caleb took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. I love you, he said quietly. I know we didn't start that way. I know it wasn't part of the arrangement, but I do. I love you, Lena Moore. Lena's heart swelled. She'd been waiting to hear those words, hoping for them, but not expecting them. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have for a while. I just didn't know if I was allowed to. You're allowed to feel anything you want, to be anything you want. Caleb pulled her closer. You're not that invisible woman selling bread anymore. You're my wife, James's mother, a woman who stood up to the richest man in town and won. You're remarkable. They sat in comfortable silence as night settled over the ranch, two people who'd been broken by loss and remade by love and determination. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more moments of doubt and struggle, but they would face it together, the way they'd faced everything else since that desperate day in the town square. Inside the cabin, James stirred and cried out in his sleep. Lena started to rise, but Caleb stopped her. I'll get him. You rest. She watched him go inside, heard his soft voice comforting their son, and felt a peace so profound it was almost painful. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Not rescue, not salvation, just partnership. Family. A place where she mattered and was seen and was loved. She'd come to this ranch as a stranger, helping with a dying baby for 3 days. She'd stayed because running seemed easier than facing the town's judgment. But somewhere in the journey from stranger to wife to mother, she'd found something she'd thought was lost forever when Rose died. She'd found home, not a place, but people. A husband who saw her worth. A son who needed her. A future built on hard work and honest love instead of desperation and convenience. Caleb returned to the porch, James settled and sleeping again. He sat beside Lena and wrapped his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, and together they watched the stars wheel overhead, bearing witness to the quiet miracle of two broken people who'd found a way to be whole together. In September, they would have their real wedding, surrounded by the community that had once rejected them, but now respected them. They would speak vows that meant everything, chosen freely instead of desperately. They would celebrate not just their marriage, but their survival, their victory over a system designed to crush people like them. But for now, on this quiet summer night, they simply sat together on their porch, on their ranch with their son sleeping inside, and they were content. The past was honored, but not controlling. The future was uncertain, but hopeful. And the present, this moment of peace and love and hard-won joy, was more than either of them had dared to dream possible. They had fought for this, had bled for it, had stood together against a town and a bank and all the forces that wanted them to fail. And they had won. Not perfectly, not easily, but completely. They had built a family from nothing but need and courage and the stubborn refusal to let the world decide their worth. And that family, imperfect, hard-won, fiercely loved, was the greatest victory either of them would ever know. The woman no one would touch had become a wife, a mother, a force the town could no longer ignore. The desperate man with the dying baby had become a husband, a father, a rancher with a future, instead of just a past. And together, they had proven that dignity isn't given by towns or banks, or people who judge worth by wealth and appearance. Dignity is forged in the moments when you choose to stand up, to fight back, to love fiercely, despite every reason not to. They had chosen each other when no one else would, and that choice had saved them both.